I mentioned earlier that my anxiety, which has been something that I've dealt with for my entire life, and frankly not necessarily dealt with in an active management way until it gets really out of hand. Chiropractic care has been really, really helpful for me to manage my anxiety. My anxiety was regulated almost immediately, and that really surprised me and kind of gave me the bug to be really consistent about my care. I was fortunate enough that my period came back, I think, also pretty quickly, like 6 weeks or 7 weeks after starting care. But I think more generally, if I took a step back and setting aside the uniqueness of my case, I would say that chiropractic care has just helped me feel like a more steady, consistent version of myself.
Can you describe what you were experiencing before you started care with us?
I originally sought out care because my husband and I were planning to start a family, and I had been on birth control for several years and had recently come off birth control and knew that I had not really ever had a consistent cycle, and it was something that I was working through. And so it wasn't really necessarily that I was symptomatic, but it was more the absence of symptoms or the absence of sort of regularity that made me seek out care. And so I saw a friend through Instagram who had used Dr. Tom for reestablishing her cycle, and that was what made me seek out Dr. Tom as well. There have been some really helpful, positive externalities I didn't expect as well. Chiropractic care has been really, really helpful for me to manage my anxiety and just sort of stay sort of steady mentally, but that was not something I sort of expected when I was originally looking for care.
Yeah, absolutely. And what were some of the other ways you were trying to fix some of the problems that you were having?
To be honest, I didn't really have much of a plan except for give it time. My doctors weren't super concerned about the transition off of birth control, and that is something that I think every body handles differently. I just knew it was going to be hard for me because I had come off the pill previously to freeze my eggs, and it had been really, really difficult for my body to find its rhythm.
Yeah. And how confident were you that you could resolve these issues?
I wasn't confident, and I knew that it would take a long time to prove that time wasn't an effective solution.
Yeah. And when you thought about trying to heal these issues, where were you getting your information or doing your research to try and figure out what to do?
Google, my doctor, but there isn't or wasn't really clear consensus, I think, especially for women who are exploring fertility. There's not really a good place to go where you feel like you can be heard 360 degrees as a person versus just individual issues that various different doctors are treating.
Yeah, totally get that. Super difficult to navigate that without confidence. And so how did you decide what you thought might work and what might not work and what you wanted to put your time towards?
I figured that with seeking out some alternative approaches like chiropractic care or maybe things that weren't as standard, that there'd be kind of no downside risk. And so I figured, well, it can't hurt, and to go a couple of times a week and take some time to just lay down and have a break from the day wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. And if it works, it works. And otherwise, I wasn't really sure what to try aside from kind of standard things, staying healthy, staying with my exercise, eating well, but I was doing those things already. So those weren't net new choices. And so I was just sort of prioritizing new moments where I knew, well, the worst that can happen is that I've just taken a little time out of my day, which, to be honest, like I could use a pause typically anyway. And so it wasn't a huge risk.
Yeah. And, everybody that is dealing with something usually aren't dealing with it like on a short term, and they have to figure out, how long they're willing to wait before they start some form of intervention, whether that's alternative or not. What made you finally decide to make the change, when you started coming in and start getting care with us?
I knew that for someone my age, and I'm 35, that if my husband and I wanted to start a family soon, that a doctor would typically not intervene for 6 to 12 months post starting trying to conceive. And, um, if you like sort of play the math forward on that, that means that it could have been multiple years before we were fortunate enough to become pregnant and then have a child ultimately. We hope to have more than one child. And so the timeline kind of starts to compound. And so once we made the decision to have children, I was pretty aggressive about doing everything in my power to be really, really healthy and ready for that pregnancy. The decision to have a baby was probably a longer decision, but that's more of a discernment process than simply the health provide the health of the mother in that regard.
After making the decision to start, and now you've started, how would you describe the change that you saw after starting care with us?
I mentioned earlier that my anxiety, which has been something that I've dealt with for my entire life, and frankly, not necessarily dealt with in an active management way until it gets really out of hand. My anxiety was regulated almost immediately, and that really surprised me and kind of gave me the bug to be really consistent about my care, because I would notice when I was not as consistent coming in. I was fortunate enough that my period came back, I think, also pretty quickly, like 6 weeks or 7 weeks after starting care. And that was also unexpected relative to my expectations. And frankly, Dr. Tom and I weren't exactly sure. We weren't exactly sure what was going to happen. And so I didn't have a timeline in mind. But that happened very quickly. And so I was really pleasantly surprised. And I know that that's also not necessarily what we should expect for everything. Now that I'm in more of maintenance care, I don't expect miracles every time I come in, but I also know that the consistency shows up in my body over time.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so different because you are a little bit of a unique case on how quickly you saw changes, not only with, the anxiety and the mental state, but also with, hormones and cycle regulation, because the way that we talk about it is that, chiropractic isn't really a cure for anything, but a way to help your body function better as a whole. And so that's where we can holistically support that body. And so super unique, but really love, how quick you saw those changes for your benefit to, see that little one come along quicker. And so if you had to tell someone the best thing that has happened since being under care with us, what would you say that was?
Well, I had a son, so that's probably hard to compete with. But I think more generally, if I took a step back and setting aside the uniqueness of my case, I would say that chiropractic care has just helped me feel like a more steady, consistent version of myself. I don't think it works miracles for highs or for lows, but it's something that I know helps me really regulate being who I am and showing up consistently across all areas of my life. And that is something that I think almost everyone can empathize with and probably wants to feel a little bit more consistency about in the world that we live in.
Totally agree with you. That's one thing that I try to share with, other adults or parents talking about their kids, is that the care is going to not only help them feel more connected to themselves, but also more connected to those around them. And so really an awesome way for you to put that. Love that. And so how would you describe the experience working with us as a whole?
Easy across the board, from the context of the billing cycle, which is a subscription, so I don't even think about it, to how to get appointments. I schedule appointments sometimes a week in advance and sometimes a minute in advance and sometimes via text message. And it's always really easy. I log in with my face, so I'm not even typing. And then the care is really efficient. I love that it's 5 minutes. I leave my hazard lights on. I run in to the office, and um, yet I always feel like I'm not just a person to get through the cycle. You always listen to me if I have something I'm pointing out. What's impressive is you often will have noticed those things before I have. And so it's always great to have that level of care, but it also is in the context of something that I can really easily make fit into my life instead of trying to fit my life around a medical appointment, which is so typical when you think of like other doctors.
Yeah. And were there any specific moments or aspects of our service that really stood out to you?
I'll answer it two ways. One, I think, is it's rare to find a service provider that you're seeing so consistently that is consistently just easy to get with. I don't think I've ever waited more than 10 minutes. I don't think I've ever had an issue with scheduling or payment or any of the logistics of a service, which at this point, in well over a year, you kind of would have expected would have happened at least once. So, one thing I'll just call out is that the absence of a specific moment of pain is like somewhat remarkable. The second thing I'll say is that I think there was a really special moment to me that I don't even know if you remember, where I actually like got to tell you I was pregnant, and it was, I hadn't shared with hardly anyone in the world yet. And that was such a special moment because it was in the context of, again, a 5 to 10 minute service encounter, which is usually pretty quick. But it was really special to get to share. And I could see that like it was a really special moment in your eyes. And I felt like we were just such a team. And it was such a cool way to share that with a doctor in my life. And then like now we're 10 months later and the baby's here.
No, I do remember that. And I do remember that quiet, special moment, in our open adjusting area. And just, yeah, those moments obviously do, sit with me, being somebody that really focuses on connecting with people at this higher level. And so really did love being able to share that with you. And so how did our specific approach, how do you feel that helped your body begin to heal effectively?
I have the evidence that shows that it did heal. So I don't even think it's a feeling. I think I have outcomes in my life that I can point to that show that this is making a difference. And obviously, I don't have the counterfactual of my life lived without chiropractic care, but I do have a pretty powerful set of lived experiences that I wouldn't have or didn't have before I started seeking it out. So I don't think it's a feeling. I think I have real data points. That said, I also think that, I don't know, I'd say it the same way. I feel more like myself in a more present and thorough way.
Yeah, that's great. And to wrap it all up, what would you say to another person who's in the same position you were in and they're trying to decide if they want to try chiropractic care?
I would say two things. I would say, one, here's my experience, and hopefully that's helpful. But if someone was perhaps more like me and a little bit more skeptical, I would ask them, what's the risk? And there's sort of unlimited upside that you could just go and give it a chance. And there's very little downside from seeking it out. And maybe those experiences will give someone else the confidence to see the results for themselves versus being convinced by another person's experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experience. Thank you so much for trusting me with your family's care. And I look forward to taking care of you guys in the future.